Okay, let's just jump right in. What if one of the most famous lines in all of Scripture wasn't just poetry? What if God is light was actually a statement of physics? In this explainer, we're going to unpack a really fascinating, pretty dense argument that connects ancient theology with the fundamental laws of our universe. And it challenges, well, everything we think we know about reality itself.
It all kicks off with this one simple, powerful statement. For centuries, pretty much everyone has read this as poetry. But the source material we're looking at, it takes a completely different approach. It treats this line like an axiom, the bedrock truth for an entire model of reality.
And for most of history, the interpretation has been pretty straightforward. When you hear God is light, you think of it as a metaphor, right? It stands for purity, goodness, truth, all that stuff. Light gets rid of darkness, just like God's truth gets rid of ignorance. It's powerful, it's beautiful, and it's always been seen as symbolic. But this is where the source material we're digging into just throws a wrench in the whole thing. It asks this really radical question. What if the author, John, wasn't being poetic at all? What if he was making a direct, literal statement about the fundamental nature of, well, existence? A statement of physics. And that right there is the core idea. The entire argument we're about to explore hinges on taking that one statement with absolute, total literalness. And as you're about to see, this leads to some truly mind-bending scientific implications. So here's the crucial point. The source argues that God is light is a statement of ontological identity. Now, that's a fancy term, but what it means is simple. It's not saying God is like light or similar to light. No, it's saying that God and light are in their most fundamental being the exact same thing. Now, if that's true, just think about the consequences for a second. They are immediate and they are huge. All of a sudden, the laws of physics, relativity, thermodynamics, quantum mechanics, they're not some external rulebook that God has to follow. Instead, they become the mathematical language describing God's own unchanging nature. Okay, so taking this idea literally immediately forces us to completely reevaluate creation itself. And we have to start right at the beginning, with the very first command in the book of Genesis. So, to build this case, the argument pulls in one of the most foundational principles in all of science, the first law of thermodynamics. You probably know it as the conservation of energy. It's a law that, as far as we've ever seen, has never been broken. Energy can change form, but the total amount of it in the universe always stays the same. And this leads to a pretty powerful logical chain of thought. Follow me on this. Light is a form of energy, right? And according to that first law, energy cannot be created or destroyed. So, therefore, light itself must be uncreated and eternal. This is a direct challenge to the idea that light was just, poof, made out of nothing at the dawn of time. And this is where we get to a really crucial distinction that the source makes. The biblical story of creation, specifically in Genesis when it says, "Let there be light," gets totally reframed. It's no longer an act of creation ex nihilo, making something out of absolutely nothing. Instead, it's an act of expression. It's the eternal, uncreated reality of light just revealing itself, making itself visible. So in this way of thinking, the command, "Let there be light," isn't about, firing up the cosmic photon factory. No, it is the Eternal One, who is light, basically saying, let my own nature become visible now. It's a moment that structures the entire cosmos. It's a revelation, not a fabrication. Okay, so if the laws of physics really are the language of God's nature, then what do they actually tell us about God? Well, this is where the argument gets really interesting, because it starts drilling down into the known properties of light and reinterpreting them as divine theological attributes. And the source points to some really amazing parallels here. For instance, the speed of light is the only true constant in the entire universe. That mirrors the idea of God's unchanging nature. And get this, from its own frame of reference, a photon experiences zero time. It's timeless. That lines up perfectly with the concept of eternity. And because light isn't bound by space in the same way matter is, you get a reflection of omnipresence. So you might be wondering, what about miracles? In this framework, the source argues that miracles are not God breaking the rules of physics. Not at all. Instead, they're demonstrations of a complete and total mastery of those rules.
Think about it like a master computer programmer who can use the code in ways a beginner can't even imagine. It looks like magic, but it's really just a higher order expression of the system, not a violation of it. And this next quote from the source really just sums up the whole relationship perfectly. Physics isn't some kind of cage that contains God. It's the very signature of his consistent and rational nature, written right into the fabric of reality itself.
Okay, now, you might want to buckle up for this next part because this is probably the most radical claim in the entire framework. The source takes Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, and proposes that it's not just a law of physics, it's a theological formula describing the nature of the Christian Trinity.
All right, let's break this down piece by piece. In this mapping, E for energy is said to correspond to the spirit, the ruach, the animating force of everything. Then you have M for mass. That corresponds to the word, the logos, the embodied physical structure of reality. And finally, C squared, the constant of light, is mapped to the Father, the eternal, unchanging foundation that everything else is built on. So with that E equals mc squared trinity in mind, the source then argues that those ancient primordial terms we see in the second verse of Genesis, well, they aren't describing some chaotic, watery mess. They're actually naming these fundamental components of reality we just talked about. So first up, you have Tehom, or the deep. In this model, that's not a literal ocean. No, it's the unexpressed, foundational constant of reality. It's the c squared in our equation. It's the dimension where darkness exists before light is revealed. Then there's Ruach, the spirit. This is identified directly with the E for energy. So it's not some abstract, ghostly idea, but the literal animating energy hovering over the unformed stuff of the universe. And finally, we have Mayim, the waters. This represents the unformed mass field of reality. It's the meme in the equation. It's the potential substance that's just waiting to be given structure and form by the word. So what happens when we put all these pieces together? What we get is a framework that presents this complete, coherent picture, one where ancient scripture and modern physics aren't fighting each other. In fact, they might just be telling the exact same story. Really, what we've just walked through is a complete, self-consistent worldview. It argues that there isn't one reality for faith and a totally separate one for science. Instead, there's just one reality described in two very different languages. And the Rosetta Stone, the key that could unify them, is the identity of light. And all of this leaves us with one final, pretty provocative thought. It is so easy to dismiss ancient texts as primitive or metaphorical, but this entire framework challenges us to ask a different question. What if the oldest stories in the world actually contain the newest science? What if they hold a description of reality so profound that we're only now, thousands of years later, finally developing the scientific language to even begin to understand it?